So, the so-called Super League has seemingly crashed and burnt already, going up in a ball of flames even quicker than the Frank de Boer experiment at Crystal Palace. Ed Woodward has agreed to resign at the end of this season, Florentino Perez and Andrea Agnelli appear to be having crisis talks, and Gary Neville is knocking back a glass of red in celebration on Twitter. At least, at the time of this recording that is. By the time this video comes out, who knows what will have happened. Such is the pace of change in world football right now. However, John Henry, Joel Glazer, and all the real money men who backed these half-baked proposals without a second's consideration for the views of so-called legacy supporters are still among the most powerful people in the game. The Champions League is still facing a major multi-billion-dollar overhaul to appease these avaricious ghouls to the detriment of the sport, and further concessions will be fought for by these clubs, owners, and special interest groups unless they are opposed just as vociferously and unequivocally as they have been in regard to the so-called Super League. As far as I'm concerned, football is now at a crossroads. Supporters can either learn from this experience and take it into future battles, fighting to actively improve the game rather than just trying to prevent it from being further pillaged, or they consider the so-called Super League to have been the entire war, rather than just an individual battle, and the sport continues down a long track of sanitization and commercialization, alienating the very people who popularised the sport in the United Kingdom in the mid to late 1800s before spreading it around the world. Fans have power in numbers, just as people do when combating issues outside of the game, but only when we get organised and make ourselves heard, just as happened over the last few days. Whether that will happen, I have my doubts, but I'd rather focus my attention on being part of the solution than being resigned to defeat. However much the odds of this actually becoming a really seminal moment in the history of the sport may be stacked against us. It's easy to point out the flaws in football though, isn't it? And I've certainly done plenty of it on this channel over the years. But what about offering up some solutions? Theodore Roosevelt once said that nothing in the world is worth having or worth doing unless it means effort, pain and difficulty. And no doubt, none of these reforms would come about easily, but nor are they impossible. I have focused on the club game, despite the state of play being arguably even worse on the international stage, Qatar, and particularly on the Premier League, but many of my points could be replicated in other leagues. I'm only focusing on the Premier League as a starting point, since it is the league that I know best. Right. Some of them may be a bit rough around the edges. Like all the videos I've made this week, it was hastily assembled with pretty rapid turnover and very little sleep, but hopefully they can kickstart some interesting conversations. Here is my 7-point plan to save football. Match spending scheme. There has been a bit of a narrative that has emerged over the last few days trying to blame players and agents for the so-called Super League. The idea being that if they didn't demand such lucrative contracts, clubs wouldn't have to seek out alternative sources of income in order to remain profitable. I think that is absolute nonsense. If any other business gives its employees stupid salaries that it can't afford and subsequently starts losing money, would people blame the employees or the people who run the company? I'd imagine you would blame the people running the business, so I'm not sure why that should be any different in football. That's just a small aside relating to point number 1 though, which is about wages. There's been a lot of talk about wage caps in football for a while now, which I wouldn't actually support. For the most part, wage caps just tend to result in owners keeping more revenue that is generated by players and staff. If you paid to watch Manchester United, surely you'd rather that money be funneled into the players' pockets than adding to the Glazers family's wealth extraction from your club. But that doesn't mitigate the fact that there is clearly a disparity between how much teams pay players and wages are getting out of hand. My solution would be to create a benchmark for every single Premier League team of, say, £100 million, which would be enough to pay an entire squad of players £75,000 a week, albeit that is excluding staff, but for every pound that you spend over that amount, you have to put an additional pound into an FA fund created solely for projects in grassroots, lower league, non-league, women's football, and so on and so forth. As with a number of these ideas, it could be tweaked. So maybe £100 million isn't the benchmark. Maybe it's £75 million or £125 million. Maybe it is staggered, so for every pound you spend between 75 and £100 million, you have to match with 25p, from 100 to 125 million, 50p, and so on, almost like a progressive footballing tax. You could also extend the scheme beyond just wages to all spending excluding infrastructure projects and any development or community expenditure. UEFA FFP rules already deduct those costs, so that could be easily done, and I think this scheme would be infinitely more useful than FFP, which, aside from having proved to be totally ineffective, even if it were effective, only really serves to cement the status quo, ensuring that the richest clubs right now can continue to outspend the rest and maintain monopolies over trophies and success. Personally, I don't mind wealthy benefactors ploughing money into clubs that they will never get back, so long as that money either benefits football or at least isn't hostile to the sport. The key is to make sure that the checks and balances are in place to prevent owners from spending recklessly and then leaving clubs in the lurch, as was the case at Portsmouth, rather than owners just spending recklessly with their own money, like Roman Abramovich in the early 2000s at Chelsea. So I would scrap FFP and bring in a matched spending, pound for pound or pennies on the pound at a certain threshold scheme, meaning that clubs who chose to buy success can still do so, but not without benefiting the sport as a whole. 10-80-10 rule. If you're wondering what the hell the 10-80-10 rule is, then don't worry, I've just made it up. This is my 7-point plan to save football after all. This is a point about ticket prices, which have just spiralled way out of control during the Premier League years. In 2011, David Conn found that whilst inflation had risen 77% over the last 20 years, the price of the cheapest season ticket at Anfield had risen by 1,108% during that same time. That is simply not sustainable, and it's a major reason why supporters at Premier League grounds have become older, greyer, quieter, and wealthier for the last quarter of a century. Young people, and those on low incomes more broadly, are being priced out of what once was the working man and woman sport. Most frustratingly of all, for many teams at the highest level, tickets constitute for an increasingly minimal percentage of their overall revenue. However, by pricing out low-income, young, local people from grounds, you can charge more for your shirts, merchandise, food and drink. It's the grim reality of modern-day football. My solution is the 10-80-10 rule. Clubs would be obligated to give 10% of tickets for their home games away for free to local school children, as has been tried and tested with success at a number of clubs already. The massive bulk of ticket sales, 80%, would be capped at £20 for adults and £10 for concessions. Right now, well, before the pandemic at least, only 21% of Premier League tickets were sold for £20 or less, almost exclusively to children accompanied by parents who were paying far more. That is less than the number of tickets, 26%, that cost in excess of £40. And finally, the last 10% would be the clubs to do as they please with. Corporates, sponsors, prawn sandwiches, a meal before the match, guided tours, the lot. You could even put up a fence to protect the landed gentry from the baying mob of peasants either side of them, and charge £5,000 a ticket just to make sure that none of the riffraff gets in. Do as you please with that 10%, but it can't be more than 10%. This would cause a minor dent in the back pocket of the country's richest clubs, whilst making football accessible to a whole new generation of fans and bring the sport back into the hands of those who popularised it in the first place. I'd also like to see a big, continued drive for safe standing once fans are allowed back in the ground, but I've only got 7 points, so that one will have to wait for now. The 50+1 rule. Whilst on the topic of numbers followed by the word rule, unlike the last one, as you probably know, this one isn't a creation of my own. There are many things that the Germans do better than us here in the UK, and indeed, across much of the world, which we could probably do to learn from. The 50+1 rule is undoubtedly one such example, and introducing it to the English game is an overwhelmingly popular reform among supporters. The Labour Party actually backed giving supporters a controlling stake in their club's affairs in the 2019 election, though obviously they didn't win that election. The Scottish Greens and Scottish Labour still back the introduction of the 50+1 rule, so with enough momentum, I don't think it is unthinkable that this could be pushed through. Whilst you might be thinking that, typically, you wouldn't expect the Conservative Party to back such proposals, we have a Conservative Prime Minister who is more concerned with popularity than principles, and this is a popular proposal. So, if it's made clear that this is something that people want, particularly in seats that he won in 2019 and needs to retain, we could see political unity on this issue alongside considerable pressure from supporters. Is the 50+1 rule perfect? No. Is it better than what we've got now? 100%. If I was king of football, I'd implement it yesterday, and then we can set about tweaking and improving it with time. Don't make the perfect the enemy of the good, in the sort of not really badly translated words of Voltaire. Make the Champions League, FA Cup, and England games free to air. The amount of football on TV today is absolutely insane. There is football on TV every night of the week with wall-to-wall coverage over the weekend. But at what cost? If kids are losing interest in football, or the 18 to 24 bracket, as was talked about in the so-called Super League's proposals, which I think they are, and that ought to be of a concern, then making football affordable to watch both live in a stadium and on TV would do far more to change that than any tedious ring-fenced competition. Without sounding like a jaded 90-year-old man, the Champions League was one of the tournaments that made me fall in love with football, along with England, outside of my beloved Hull City, who I was fortunate enough to be able to go and see live at least every other weekend. I can remember being so excited watching the likes of Pavel Nedved and Edgar Davids playing for Juventus in the Champions League on the big boxy TV in our lounge against Manchester United with my dad in what must have been 2003. It seemed so special. The anthem, that great Champions League ball, the continent's finest, meeting on hallowed turf. ITV lost the rights to the Champions League to BT Sport in 2015. If you don't already have BT broadband or BT TV packages, or an EE mobile phone contract, BT Sport costs £29.99 a month. So, in a country where a third of all kids are growing up in poverty, an annual cost of £360 to watch just a certain number of live football matches is clearly prohibitive. To watch every live game, your cheapest option in the United Kingdom is a Now TV monthly subscription, along with BT and Amazon, which will set you back almost £700 a year. The reality is that watching football live in a stadium or on TV has become a habit of the comfortable and well-off, rather than one of low-income, working-class communities. Many children in the UK will be deprived of the magical Champions League nights and awe-inspiring FA Cup upsets that I grew up watching on ITV and BBC as a child as a result of paywalls. So, is it really any wonder that some of them won't grow up with the same level of affection for the sport as I did and people who are older than me? In the same way that the World Cup and Euros are ring-fenced from the likes of Sky and BT, I'd like to see the same restrictions come into play for the Champions League, at least for games involving domestic clubs, and the final, the FA Cup, where the bulk of games are currently broadcast on BT, including the final, and all internationals involving home nation teams. Mandatory tribunal fees. The way tribunal fees currently work in English football is that if a player who is under the age of 24 runs down his contract to join a new club, a tribunal will set a fee that the player's new club has to pay to the teams who developed him over the years. Sometimes these fees are negligible, sometimes they're more sizable, rarely are they to everyone's satisfaction. The problem that we have is that when a lesser team develops or signs a good player, they tend to lose them very quickly. This hasn't always been the case. There was a time when Stoke City, Preston North End and Blackpool could develop the likes of Stanley Matthews, Tom Finney and Stan Mortensen and get many years of fine service out of those players. Now, that was because of the retain and transfer system and the maximum wage, the first of which certainly no one wants to see reintroduced. I cannot think of an effective way to combat this problem without infringing upon a player's right to seek out alternative employment. However, there are ways in which we could at least properly remunerate teams who go to the effort of developing talented young players. Regardless of the fee a team pays a club for a young player, say, still aged under 24, they could be obligated to pay certain fees when certain clauses are triggered to the team or teams who develop said player. So, when a player plays a certain number of Premier League, Champions League or international fixtures, the team who honed their skills is rewarded. Currently, we have a system whereby teams are axing their youth budgets because it isn't financially viable to develop players if the best ones are lost for peanuts. Not only would this see teams be more incentivized to focus on youth development, knowing that they would be rewarded for nurturing talent, it would also disincentivize bigger clubs from hoovering up talent due to the costs involved. Especially when they know that all the spending over a certain amount that they make will have to be matched in spending to the FA grassroots, lower league, non-league, women's game and community fund. Yes, that's right, all of these rules are coming into effect at the same moment in time, just once I'm appointed king of the world. Reform the loan system. This rule would attempt to address the same problem that I just talked about. Whilst I don't know of any way that you could fairly enforce a way in which to keep talented young players at lesser teams for longer without impeding upon a player's basic human rights, though I am happy for someone else to come up with a suggestion on that front and prove me wrong, this rule would act as yet another deterrent to halt teams from hoarding players, and particularly young players, thus allowing them to keep playing and keep developing at their current clubs for longer. For the record, this is a bigger point than just wanting clubs to be rewarded for developing players or wanting youngsters to get more first-team football. It goes to the very heart of the sport's widening inequalities. When Stoke had Matthews and Middlesbrough had Wilf Mannion, it provided them with a huge star attraction for young fans and indeed supporters of all ages. These clubs might not necessarily have been winning trophies, but they still had star men, some of the best players in the country, who were worth the admittedly much more modest admission fee in those days alone. FIFA has already proposed regulations on loan moves, limiting teams to a maximum of 8 international loan moves in total, both in terms of incomings and outgoings, set to be tightened further to just 6 in 2022-23. That's better than nothing, but doesn't go anywhere near far enough. I'd cap Premier League teams at 6 loans either in or out, both domestically and internationally. Chelsea currently have 32 players out on loan, more than the 25 that you can register in a Premier League squad, which is patently absurd. 6 is more than enough for any top-flight team. The obstacle to this would be the very biggest clubs, such as Man City and the City Football Group, simply selling rather than loaning players out to their satellite teams and then either playing them there or loaning them out once again from there, but I'm sure we could think of a rule to either prevent or at least greatly deter teams from doing that as well with time. Redistribution. The Premier League's so-called top 6 or Big 6 have already made it very clear that the Premier League can afford to redistribute a significant chunk of their TV revenue. Project Big Picture proposed giving a one-off payment to the EFL of £250 million, along with 25% of all future Premier League TV money. Those plans were rejected because it also represented a ludicrous power grab by the same money men who just tried to wrestle away with the so-called Super League, but that doesn't mean that we can't steal the best bits. The 25% of Premier League TV money would be enough to make the EFL sustainable, in a way that it simply isn't now. But some of that money ought to also go into the non-league game and other areas rather than just the EFL. So, yeah, bin the power grab, but steal the redistribution. They can hardly argue that they can't afford it when they put forward those proposals which included it in the first place. The least willing to sign up would likely be the rest of the Premier League, but as with all these rules, there would be lots of people who wouldn't be too happy, but they're not really the people who these 7 steps are designed to appease. So basically, bad luck to them, in a world of football ruled by me. There are so many other issues in football, but I limited myself to a 7-point plan, what with this being HITC Sevens and all. There's also the fact that I wanted this to be sort of like a punchy list of 7 rules, and the video is now probably going to be the best part of 20 minutes long, but I have a habit of doing that these days. If I was also made king of world football for a day, I would strip Qatar of the World Cup overnight, I'd make 12-month bans compulsory for players found guilty of racism, I would scrap VAR, at least in its current form, and I'd fire the Alams directly into the sun. Not really, but I'd ban them from owning a football club, and force them to actually sell Hull City for £1. As I said at the beginning, what matters most is that football fans seize this opportunity to realise that they can dictate the future direction of the sport. You are both the customer and indeed the product, whether that be selling you tickets and subscriptions, or selling on your eyeballs and attention to advertisers, and probably, let's be honest, some dodgy third-party data companies. Maybe you like my suggested reforms, maybe you don't. Maybe you like some and not others. But you have the power to push for what is best for the game. Not just for a handful of billionaires, some of whom only have a very fleeting and vested interest in football, and some of whom probably genuinely do not care at all. I'm not kidding when I say some of them probably haven't sat through 90 minutes of football willingly in their entire life. I sound very preachy, which is regrettable, but it is true, and it's something that actually goes beyond football. Over the course of 2 or 3 days, fans as a collective united against being screwed by extremely wealthy, very selfish people who don't care about them on this single issue. Might I suggest that football isn't the only area of life in which this has happened, but I suppose that's a bigger point for another time and quite possibly a different platform. Nonetheless, thank you all sincerely as ever for watching. Please do hit the like button if you enjoyed today's video, let me know your thoughts down below in the comments, and make sure that you are subscribed and have notifications turned on for HITC Sevens. You can also find me on Twitter or Instagram by the username at HITC Sevens on both, should you wish to do so.